Okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to do a little introduction of our speaker today. Um, and I'm thrilled to introduce you to Nick Petrie, who's a Milwaukee-based, best-selling, award-winning author of the Peter Ash thrillers. And here's book one in the series that I had just recently read, and he's really good, and I highly recommend. Um, and that book won the ITW Thriller and Barry Awards and was nominated for the Edgar, Anthony, and Hammett Awards. And the eighth book in the series, called The Price You Pay, came out last month and has been garnering all kinds of high praise. And in between, he's won the Literary Award from the Wisconsin Library Association, named one of Apple's 10 writers to read, and his book Light It Up, which is number 3 in the series, was named Apple iBooks Thriller of the Year. And so today, Nick's going to talk with us about everything from life logistics to work habits to the mental and emotional aspects of the writing life. And I'm certain before the hour is up, we'll all have learned something new and valuable for improving our own writing and getting it noticed. So now I'm going to turn the Zoom spotlight over to Nick.
Well, thanks so much, Janice, and thanks for having me, everybody, at Speed City, which is, I have to say, the coolest name for a writing group I've ever heard. I've been having these conversations for quite a few years now with other writers, aspiring writers. Janice and I were just talking about this. Um, and so this is the first time I've sort of put all of this in one place. So my goal is that there sort of be something for every writer, depending on what level you're at. If you're just starting out, if you've been writing and publishing stories, if you've written 10 novels or 20 novels, I think there are sort of these universal sort of challenges that writers face. So I wrote for 25 years without getting published. I have a master's in fine arts. I've won a couple of short story contests, one in college and one just after I finished graduate school. But I finally sort of decided I was never going to get a book published. I was a carpenter, and I was a building inspector, and I sort of tore out my kitchen, which is what we refer to in our house as sledgehammer therapy, and was rebuilding my kitchen. And my wife said to me, Nick, you're kind of a pain in the butt to live with when you don't have a writing project. And so I started this other book that I had no expectation would ever see the light of day. It was just the book I wanted to read. It was about all the things that were swirling around in my head, which at the time were the great crash of '07. I was also, as a building inspector, I was watching all of these people being foreclosed out of their homes. I had clients who were coming home from overseas, from combat, who were buying their first home around the same time. And I was reading the news about how the people who had basically caused and profited from this colossal financial crisis were basically getting away with it. And so I sort of, all of that ended up in this book that, again, my wife, who is really, it's essential to have a good partner. She said, you either need to stop talking about this book or you need to put it in the mail. So I sent it off to an agent, and she said, boy, I hope you think I'm your agent, because I can sell the hell out of this thing. And that's the book that was nominated for 6 awards and won 3, became a national bestseller, and launched this 8-book series. So, I'm living proof that persistence is all. The thing that I think about a lot as a writer, I went to a reading by Seamus Heaney, who is the Irish poet and won the Nobel, was a Nobel laureate. And someone in the audience asked him, what's the most challenging thing about writing poetry? And he said, getting started, keeping going, and getting started again. And I loved sort of the inherent failure in that statement. I loved that it really encapsulated for me, the whole writing process, right? Getting started, keeping going, and getting started again. So I thought I would kind of use that as a way to organize this a little bit. To talk a little first about sort of getting started. So whether it's beginning a new project or kind of how you start your writing session. So I bring in every book. Every book for me starts with this idea, and it's up on a note card on my wall, which you're recording, so I'm not going to show you because it's got all it's got all the plot details for my current book on it. But there's a note card that says, "Just write a bad book," because I think that is the thing that is the most helpful to me, that sort of turns off that perfectionist impulse that the first sentence has to be perfect, the first paragraph has to be perfect. Um, and I don't know, so I think it really depends on who you are as a person, right? So I'm from the Midwest. I want everybody to like me, and I want to show up on time, and I want to do a good job. I think those are kind of very Midwestern traits. And I'm a perfectionist. I got that from my dad. And I think those are not necessarily assets as a writer. So I think a lot about how to sort of turn off some of that stuff. And at bottom, this is really a conversation about process. So it's important to figure out how you work best. And again, many of you have been doing this for a number of years. So you probably have figured out that you work better in the morning, or you work better after lunch, or you work better after dinner. But I think, especially for beginning writers, that finding your process is as important, if not more important, than finding your voice. The other thing that for me is really important is to clean out the clutter, in both, physically, mentally, metaphorically. Martha Graham, I think it's Martha Graham, I can't track down this quote, has a line, "You've got to keep a clean antenna." Martha Graham was a famous choreographer. You've got to keep a clean antenna, which is you need to sort of stay focused and eliminate all of this extraneous stuff. And my son, who's went to art school as a photographer, said to me years ago that making art is an extreme sport, which is that same idea, right? That you have to focus, you have to kind of lean in and eliminate things the way that professional athletes do. So for me, I'm a morning person. I work best in the morning, and I am lucky that I get to do this full time. This is my living. So my goal is to not check the news. My phone is on do not disturb until 5:30 at night. I don't look at email if I can help it, unless there's something going on that I have to be paying attention to. I've got even an internet blocker on my computer so that I don't, gee, let's just see what's going on in the world, or, oh, I'll dive down this research rabbit hole. I try to begin the day kind of as empty as possible, if that makes any sense. The other piece of this for me is really about simplifying my life. So for those 25 years, actually 30 years, when I was an aspiring writer and not yet a published novelist, I ran a business. I've been self-employed since I was 21, 22 in there. I was married. I had a young son, and I owned an ancient house that needed really constant repairs and upgrades. And I desperately wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to write novels since I was a teenager. And so my rule of thumb was I can only do 3 things at a time. I can only effectively do 3 things at a time. And so this is, again, about being deliberate about where you put your focus. So I was never going to not be a family person, right? Like that was important to me. I needed to make a living. That was pretty much non-negotiable as well, especially those early years when my wife was home with our son. So it was balancing sort of all of the other demands on my life. So when the business was always seasonal, so there was always a lot more work in the summer, which means I got to write more in the winter. I as a younger man, I'd had hobbies. I played the guitar. I did all of this other stuff, and so as family life sort of rose up in my life, and I became more serious about writing fiction, I really dialed back on those other things because, again, to me, I could only really focus on 3 things at a time. And it's to me, it's about deciding what's important to you. So this is a little bit of a, a little bit of a, kind of a life choice thing. But for me, it's about, did I want to be a dilettante, or did I want to really make progress? Did I want to really dive into this thing? There's a great quote by Glennon Doyle. Your job throughout your entire life is to disappoint as many people as it takes to avoid disappointing yourself. And I love that. I think that's a great way to sort of think about wanting to have a creative life. So that's getting started. So in terms of keeping going, right? So there are some really simple things that people can do. Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote a great book called Big Magic about creativity, talks about how a regular work schedule lets the muse know where to find you. So I really keep a routine if possible. My life is very, very regular. It frees up a lot of mental space. It lets me think about my work while I'm doing other things. There's a concept called decision fatigue, that you only have the capacity to make a certain number of decisions in the course of the day. And this is why a lot of visual artists, for example, wear the same clothes, like Steve Jobs, right? Always wore the same outfit. Visual artists do the same thing often. They have a kind of a uniform. I know a writer who takes this to such an extreme that he eats the same breakfast every day. He walks to work along the same route every day. His office, he's got an office where he writes. Leaves at the same time, takes the same route, begins work at the same, almost the same moment every day. And that sort of discipline gives him the freedom to always be thinking, because you become an automatic pilot at a certain point. So to me, that's a big piece of how I function as a writer. The next piece is that, Hemingway, who is not one of my personal heroes, although there was a time when he was one of my literary heroes. I'm not sure that's true anymore either. But he wrote a great book about the writing life called A Movable Feast. And he talks about how writing a book is like being in training for a prize fight. So you have to stay in shape. For him, it was like, I'm not going to drink until after lunch. That's not really my thing. But I try to eat well, and I try to exercise and make sure I get sleep. I really don't drink very much, especially not when I'm working. And there's all of this science around exercise and being in nature and creativity. One of the things I do is when I get slowed down on something, there's something I'm trying to figure out, I go for a walk. And if I can go for a walk in nature, it's better. So I can walk around my sort of urban suburb, or I can detour and walk along the river through the trees, and I can feel the difference. So part of it is think about the ways that you can kind of recharge, and it's a simple enough thing so that when you raise your heart rate, you're actually increasing the blood flow through your body and to your brain. You're bringing more nutrients to your brain. You are refreshing your brain. So again, this is real neuroscience stuff. So, I know writers who will, they'll stop and they'll do 10 push-ups and 10 sit-ups, and then they'll get up and go back to work. That's not really my mode. I'd rather go for a walk. But again, these are some simple things we can do to kind of keep us moving and in great shape. The next piece is sort of this mental emotional. I used to think, again, Hemingway is a real model for this, that to be a great writer, you had to be miserable. Faulkner and Fitzgerald and Hemingway, you had raging alcoholics for the most part, right? But again, the longer I've done this and the more writers that I have met, the more I realize that the opposite is true. That optimism, positivity, enthusiasm are the real ingredients to being able to continue this really difficult thing, right? Writing is not an easy thing to do. Miriam Kaba, who's a mindfulness guru, has a great line: "Hope is a discipline," right? This can be learned. I am by nature kind of a glass half empty person. But even I am learning to sort of see the bright side and to imagine the best outcome instead of the worst outcome. So these are things that not just for your writing life, but for your life, can make a difference. It's made a huge difference for me. The other thing that I started doing even before the pandemic is meditating. And it's not complicated. There's not a lot to learn. I write about post-traumatic stress, among other things. And the science on meditation and post-traumatic stress and expanding your worldview, if the Army is teaching soldiers to meditate, there really has to be something in this. So I'm not a madman. I don't go on these week-long silent retreats. I know people who do this. I think they're nuts. For me, it's 10 to 15 minutes a day. I just sit and I be quiet and I try to focus on my breath. And when I fail, because that's what happens, our brains are designed to be active, right? We're always looking for the tiger in the underbrush. Is to sort of bring it back to your attention on your breath or your body or an ambient sound or something like that. There are great books on this. There are a couple of great apps that you can put on your phone. My favorite book on this is called 10% Happier by a guy named Dan Harris. He's got a great podcast as well if you want to dive in. What it does for you is it creates a little bit of space between you and your thoughts. It helps you become aware that your thoughts are not really who you are, that your thoughts just appear, they come and go, that the brain is a machine for thinking, and that you don't have to pay attention to all of it. And especially if you're somebody who, gets a little wrapped up in, sort of your own personal sense of catastrophe, as glass half empty people tend to do, I found that to be really helpful. So then in terms of sort of basic tactics and Jedi mind tricks, and again, let me know how I'm doing on time here. It's 17 after. So my goal is about 30 minutes and then questions. And again, if you want to throw questions in the chat, I'm happy to get to them as well. The biggest, quote unquote Jedi mind trick, and this is a Star Wars reference, you guys may not all be such geeks, is this idea of fooling your mind to some extent, right? For me, it's trying to keep these two opposing thoughts in my mind at the same time. That my writing project, and this is my living, right? This is what pays my mortgage. That my writing project is both the most important thing that I have to do at any given time, and also that it's not important at all. That this is just play. We are children telling stories to each other. And to somehow, if you can hang on to both of those at the same time, what I have found is that it mitigates sort of some of that stress and anxiety, and lets you, having it be important means that you are focused and you're paying attention and you are trying to do the best job that you can. But having it be unimportant gives it a lightness, right? Gives it a playfulness that for me is super helpful. And if you are a career person, right? So I've run a business my whole life. I tend to be a business-minded person. For a long time, it was very nuts and bolts, or really it was, hammer and nail and framing up an addition, installing kitchen cabinets, blah, blah, blah. So I have always been focused on, what is the business piece of this? What's the living to be made? Can I afford to quit my job? Et cetera, et cetera. And I finally got to the place where, for me, it's not about earning money. It's not about success, in air quotes. It really is about making the most interesting thing I can, right? To make something that's interesting to me. It's a great line. I have a lot of quotes that I cannot attribute. I have to sort of dig this up. But again, if you could see my bulletin board, you would see a vast number of note cards with quotes and stuff on them. The point of art is to make the thing you most want to see in the world. And like if that can be your lens through which you view your given project, it's not for somebody else. It's not for the market. It's not to change your life in any way or another. It is to make something interesting to you, to make something you want to see in the world. To me, I think that's sort of the most crucial idea. And that the next is something that my wife has said to me a number of times, action leads to clarity. When in doubt, try something. Margaret is very much her default is action, and my default is to sit and think about it. And I have learned that sitting and thinking becomes a circular activity. And so when in doubt, try something different. If you're having trouble on a scene, if you're having trouble, figuring out a character, one of my tricks is I write about the scene. I will, I'll be on page 27 of my document, and I'm not quite sure what happens next. I'm a pantser, by the way, so that informs a lot of this. I'll write, so what happens next, question mark, and I will start to write about what the options are. And before long, it lets you discard possibilities very quickly because you're not working on crafting the prose. But it also, at a certain point, it turns out I'm actually writing the scene. I'm not writing about the scene. I'm now it's real dialogue. Now it's real scene setting. Now it's real action. And I often do that in all caps because it's much less important, right? It doesn't mean anything if it's in all caps. I don't do quotation marks, blah, blah, blah. I just go. So again, speed is a piece of this. And then the other thing, again, writing a novel, one of the ways that people think about how to work is they have a word count for a given day or a given writing period. And I have found that it's best to not try to exceed that word count too much, because it tends to drain the reservoir for the rest of the day. I can only generate so much story in a given session, and I have learned to sort of pause and to let it gestate. The other thing I try to do is when I'm done, when I'm out of time for the day, basically, when I'm done for the day, I try to stop in the middle of a scene or a chapter so that I know what happens next. Sometimes I'll do a couple of lines in all caps about what happens next. And this is again a Hemingway trick, is to stop in the middle of something, and then you know where you're going to pick it up the next day. And it makes that getting started piece easier. And then the other trick, and I don't know where I got this, but it's not my idea, is before I go to sleep, I think about what I'm working on, just for a couple of minutes. I just sort of sit on the edge of the bed and I think, now, what was I doing today? And what were the challenges? And what do I want to do tomorrow? And I just to sort of lodge it in my brain. And then I go to sleep, because your subconscious does so much of the work as a writer. We all have these moments where we have no idea where some of these ideas, lines of dialogue, character ideas, where they come from. Well, they're coming from this story engine in the back of your head. And when you're sleeping is when your brain is reorganizing itself. It's cleaning itself. And so often when I wake up, I have a solution. It might be small. Sometimes it's bigger, and it's definitely not every day. But I have found that to be a useful tool in the sort of life hack department. On a larger scale, hang on one sec. I don't know if you've ever heard of or used a book called The Artist's Way by a woman named Julia Cameron. And it started she's a recovering alcoholic. This was written in the 70s, started out as workshops, and turned into this book, which became kind of a sensation. And the more you talk to other writers and you listen to talks or read articles by other writers, and artists, visual artists, you will hear this referenced again and again. So she comes through, because she's in recovery, she comes through this 12-step sort of mindset, this model for recovering from alcoholism. But she's essentially turned this into sort of a 12-step program for a creative life. And again, I used to be a very nuts and bolts person, and the older I get, the more kind of woo-woo I'm getting. And so, some of it is a little out there. Some of it is, there are exercises that, to me, I'm like, what is the point of this? And I get to the end and I have sort of a little, mind-blowing moment. It's 12 weeks. You can do it in an hour a day, hour and a half a day if you want to lean in. but I've found that really cleared out a lot of kind of my mental crap around the idea of making my living as a writer. So one of her principles is something called morning pages, which again has sort of entered the general consciousness. And it's wake up first thing, you take a pen and a notebook and you write, 3 pages, 20 minutes, half an hour, something. Just spill your mind out on the page, and it helps to sort of, again, kind of clear the way for the next thing. And for me, in practice, sometimes that turns into writing about what I'm going to do that day, or I discover through this a problem on the page I didn't know I had. So I found that to be a super useful thing. In general, handwriting is a super helpful thing. Let me show you a couple of tools I use. So one is this great German notebook. Can't pronounce it. Starts with an L. I can put it in the chat at the end if you like. The pages are numbered and they're blank, so that you can reference. Like if you're writing about a current project and you're thinking about something, then you can make a note that says, "See notebook, date, page number," and it helps you track it and refine things. But working with a pen as opposed to on a keyboard, your brain functions differently, right? Technology is a wonderful thing sometimes, but it's also sort of a layer, a filter. This ancient technology of pen and paper really is extraordinary, and it frees up things that you wouldn't necessarily, that you don't necessarily notice you're missing from working on a keyboard. So I will again, if things are a little dodgy and working in all caps doesn't help, I pick up my notebook and I'll start writing by hand. I'll start writing a scene by hand. And things will very often kind of come to life that way. Mark Cameron, who's a thriller writer and a friend of mine, he writes every single draft he writes with a pencil and a yellow legal pad, and it types it up at the end of the day. And to me, that's astonishing. Like I'm not sure I could ever do that. But again, he produces really good work that way. That's a completely legitimate way to work in this modern age. And then when the notebook doesn't work, I have a big art pad, 11 by 17, and I don't know. This is from a work in progress. So I'm not going to get to show you too much, but you can sort of see, it's kind of a crazy thing, right? I got arrows pointing places, little tiny print, and I start in the middle and I work my way out. So here I start with a problem or a character I'm trying to understand a little bit more about. And by the end, often it's just sort of turned into this crazy, exploded diagram, and it turns into from sort of this abstract thing. And then I'm writing lines of dialogue. I'm writing bits of scene. I'm sketching things out, because when there are no lines and you're not thinking, in a linear narrative way, right? Writing in a notebook even is inherently narrative, because you begin at the top and you end at the bottom and you turn the page, right? Writing in a document on your laptop is the same way, right? That there's a scroll from top to bottom. There is an inherent order to it. On a big blank piece of paper, there is no inherent order, right? And so that is also really freeing. It lets you kind of hack your mind a little bit to sort of open you up again. But so sometimes, again, this is back to Seamus Heaney. I can't keep going, right? It's keep going. How do you get started? How do you keep going? And then it's getting started again. So sometimes I get really stuck. Sometimes it's just life and family, right? My mother-in-law passed away last year. We had to go to Illinois and clean out her house. We painted the whole thing top to bottom. I did some repairs. Again, it was unavoidable. There was multiple family members going. It was just something that had to get done, right? Like that is what life does sometimes, right? But sometimes the work stops me. I get stuck. So what do I do to get started again? So I have suffered for most of my life from what I have thought of as writer's block. And I have found it really helpful to reframe it. So writer's block seems to me to be something that is that appears from nowhere, and it's imposed from outside, and it's like the boot that someone puts on your car, right? The traffic cops put on your car. It's not about you, and you have no control over it. And to me, that's not really a great way to think about something that may or may not be an actual problem, right? C.J. Box, who writes these great Western mysteries, doesn't believe in writer's block. He said, "Do plumbers get plumber's block?" He said, and there is some truth to that. That if you're a working writer, you need to move forward. But again, why does one get stuck? Well, I've realized that when I get stuck, there are two main reasons why a book won't move forward or begin, frankly. So for me, it's important to identify which version of that problem is. I used to get so worked up about this until I realized, I learned to ask myself, is this a book problem or is this a Nick problem? So book problems are technical problems. They're, the story or a character or a set of relationships. So the hardest part of those technical problems is just figuring out the problem. And so I don't think about the solution. I just look for the problem, because when you think about the solution, but you don't know what the problem is, that you're not going to get anywhere. So for me, I go back through my previous couple of days worth of work, and maybe I'll find a wrong turn. Maybe I'll find a wrong character choice. I'll need to insert a character, and it will be this character, but that's not the right character. Or there's a dropped thread in the narrative. There was something I was setting up, and then I forgot that I was setting it up, and I was trying to move the book forward. But when I go back, I realize, oh yeah, I spent the last 2 chapters setting up this next thing that was supposed to happen that I forgot about. Sometimes I have to go all the way back to the beginning of the book, and I will do this 3 or 4 or 5 times in the course of writing a book. And what that gives you is, and I don't know if this happens with you or not, but for me, going back to the beginning lets me clean up sort of hanging decisions, right? Are his eyes blue or green? I mean, sometimes you just can't decide, so you just do both and you move forward. But it lets you clean those things up, and it makes the book more clear in your mind. And you also discover these little breadcrumbs that you left for yourself without knowing it. These little thematic, you'll say, oh God, there are these thematic things that keep showing up. Oh, there's this, oh, this character's doing this. And you sort of start to see things a little more holistically. And then often I can see the problem a little more clearly and begin to move forward. So that's a book problem. That's a technical problem. A Nick problem is an internal problem, right? This has nothing to do with the book. This is about self-doubt, uncertainty, fear of failure, fear of success. Again, I'm a Midwesterner, right? So I want people to like me. Will people like this book? The farther I've gone into this series, the more challenging it is, because I really do have passionate and loyal readers now. Book 8, so that the dynamic changes, and you start to think about your readers differently. Gee, would they like this? Am I allowed to do that in this series? Well, it's your series. You get to do whatever you want. Is it too light? Is it too dark? Is it too something? Is it not something enough? Right. This is that internal critic stuff, that chatter, that yammering voice in your head. And that was a problem for a long, long time for me. And it's still an issue, but I've gotten better at sort of seeing it. Again, the meditation piece makes it easier to sort of see that yammering voice for what it is, right? This is the part of me that's always looking for the tiger in the underbrush. So that the ways that I use to get past this is one, accept the inevitable, right? Self-doubt and uncertainty are just part of the package of being a writer, especially being a writer who makes his living at it. Like it's one thing to remodel a kitchen, right? Remodeling a kitchen, you know what the steps are. You know the order that the steps should go in. The cabinets have to go in before the countertops go in. And when it's done, when every step is done, you can gauge the quality, right? It's really hard to gauge the quality of your own work. So for me, again, it's about accepting that self-doubt and uncertainty and learning to live with that are just part of how this works. The next question I ask myself is, what if I skip all of this added emotional labor and I just do it for fun, right? It goes back to that early principle that this is play, right? So what if I didn't have to, um, kind of carry all that crap and just have fun, just enjoy what I'm doing, and sometimes that helps as well. Then the third thing is I remind myself, almost every day at this point, that there are so many aspects to this that I can't control, right? I can't control what people will think of it. I can't control what my publisher will or won't do with it. I can't control what the sales might be. I can't control, what the critics might say. None of those things are in my control. What I can control is the one thing really is the piece of work I'm working on, is the book that I'm writing. And so if I can let go of the outcome, if I can let go of what I want the book to be in the world, because that's not up to me, it gives me a lot more energy to focus on the thing that to me is really the important part, right? Which is this thing I'm trying to make. In other words, just kind of let go as much of that mental bullshit as you can. And in the end, really, every writer, every artist has to find their own path, right? So I have, through years and years of reading and talking with other writers and talking with visual artists, I have found a way to think about this that helps me be functional and helps me lean into making something that I'm proud of. But I'm also I'm still looking. I'm still talking to people. I'm still trying to learn new ways to think about this stuff. My process, my way of working continues to evolve from book to book and sometimes from day to day. I got really stuck. I just turned a book in on Friday, and I got really stuck on the last third of it. And I got COVID, and I was down for like 2 weeks. It was really bad. And I came back and I was sort of like, what was I doing again? Right? I had the last, 30,000 words of this thing. And so as a lifelong pantser, I sort of thought, well, I don't know what happens next, but I sort of know what I want the end to be. And then I sort of built it backwards. So I became an outliner for the last third of this book. Now, I don't know if that's going to stick, but it's what I needed to do right then. And part of for me, the experience of learning about how to thrive in this is to not be set in any one way, is to try to be open and to see kind of what new paths or methods might work for you. This all really comes down to this idea of curiosity and of being curious about larger things and about bigger things. I've read so many books about creativity. Visual artists and actors often will talk about the same kinds of things. And I have learned so much from those conversations. The other interesting thing is pro athletes. I am not a sports guy, but people who are really at the top of their game, so to speak, whether they're Olympians, whether they're, basketball players, football players, runners, whatever. There's all this stuff that they do that's kind of universal, that's about focus and about visualizing and this idea of sort of positive self-talk. Again, I'm becoming groovier by the minute, which is not my normal self. But there is a universality to this, and you can apply all of these to just the challenges in your life. A loved one gets sick, a parent, begins to fail. You're having conflict in your marriage. All of these things help you sort of step outside a little bit and to think about what's really important, and to let go of the dumb stuff and to focus on the interesting stuff, the hard stuff. The last is to talk a little bit about. So my wife Margaret is a visual artist, and she hosts this podcast called Authentic Obsessions. And she's interviewing mostly visual artists, although she's actually done 2 interviews with me. She's interviewed another writer. She's got an interview with a self-help author actually coming up, which is going to be interesting. But so to hear how visual artists talk about this is often quite illuminating, because it lets you step outside of your preconceptions about writers and what they should think or should do. It lets me do that anyway. And I guess I'll leave you with this quote from painter and visual artist Chuck Close on inspiration. The advice I like to give young artists, or really anybody who will listen to me, is not to wait around for inspiration. Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and get to work. If you wait around for the clouds to part and a bolt of lightning to strike you in the brain, you are not going to do an awful lot of work. All the best ideas come out of the process. They come out of the work itself. Things occur to you. Where am I here? If you're sitting around trying to dream up a great idea, you can sit there a long time before anything happens. But if you just get to work, something will occur to you, and something else will occur to you, and something else that you reject will push you in another direction. Inspiration is absolutely unnecessary and somehow deceptive. You feel like you need this great idea before you can get down to work, but I find that's almost never the case. And I guess I could have boiled down this entire talk to just that one quote. So I'd love to hear kind of what challenges you have, what strategies that you have for all this sort of thing. Now, there's a couple of things in the chat here. Oh, what's my word count goal? My goal, I shoot for, in general, 1,000 words a day. And in theory, you could write a 90,000 word novel in 3 months. I have never come close to that. 8 months is about what it takes me. So any other thoughts or questions on this? Somebody needs to unmute, I think. All right, so maybe we're done. I don't know. So somebody gonna? Are you all sleeping here? Okay, how did I develop Peter Ash? So I talked a little bit about kind of where that first book came from, but the origin is a little more granular than that. I was a freelance building inspector. So if you hire a guy, you buy a house, you hire a guy like me to tell you what's wrong with it. And at a point, I realized that I had all of these clients who were coming back from overseas, who were combat vets. And there's something strange about me in that people tell me things. I'll be in line at the grocery store or sitting in the waiting room at the airport waiting to get on a flight, and we'll have a conversation, and somebody will tell me something very personal. I was in an Uber, and the driver started telling me about her kind of her whole life, but about her life in recovery, recovering alcoholic, and blah blah. I mean, and again, I'm really interested in people. I think that's a big part of it. So I, and then a home inspection takes between 3 or 4 hours. So we look at the outside, we look at the living space, and then we go down to the basement. And by that point, it's really just me and my client. And they're wearing an Army t-shirt, or they've got a tattoo. And I would say, so you're in the Army? Oh, you're a Marine. And we would begin to have a conversation. And the other thing about that particular moment is I'm not part of their family of origin, right? So when you've been in combat, whether you feel good about it or you feel not so good about it, you don't necessarily want to load that onto your family. You don't want them to carry that weight. The next thing is your service family, the guys that you went to war with. That's a very close bond, but it's a certain kind of bond. You don't necessarily, it's about being strong and about being dependable and about being there for each other, physically, but it's not about being vulnerable. So there are conversations it's hard to have with those folks as well. but you get some rando home inspector in your basement who's the kind of person that people tell things to, and suddenly, they're gonna see me, once for 3.5 hours or 4 hours, and then they're never gonna see me again. And so I become a perfect person to tell a story to. And that's where Peter Ash came from. Peter Ash came from this idea that I had read about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and thought about them, but I hadn't really thought about what life would be like for the people we had gone to ask to fight those wars when they came home. And there was something that was both really naive about these young people who had signed up to go to war because of an idea, often because right after 9/11 they'd signed up to protect their country, to protect democracy. Some of them signed up to get money for college. Some of them signed up to as the only way out of the small town they were living in. There are lots of reasons why people sign up, but they didn't really know what war was going to be like, and they signed up anyway. And they came home to it really changed them. And war lives with you forever. I have friends who are Vietnam vets who still dream about it every night, who still think about it every day. War never leaves you. And so, I kind of fell in love with these young men and women, and I fell down this rabbit hole of what is this like? I started reading about post-traumatic stress. I started reading about, what combat is like and what it's like to come home. And in the end, I came up with this character named Peter Ash, who's a Marine Corps veteran, who came home with post-traumatic stress that takes the form of claustrophobia. It makes it hard for him to be inside for long periods of time. And it's not post-traumatic stress is different for everybody. There are as many different flavors as there are people who suffer from it. So what I needed as a writer was to find something that contained within it some dramatic potential. And so if I had a character who was agoraphobic and couldn't go outside, well, that was going to be a certain kind of book. But it wasn't the kind of book I wanted to write because I'm an outdoors person. So I gave I gave my character claustrophobia, which meant that it was hard for him to not only be inside, but hard for him to be a part of human society, hard for him to have relationships, hard for him to consider having a family. And so that is where that character came from. And now I'm eight books into that. So let's see. The next question from Majit is, are you typically publishing about one book per year? Yeah, that's my goal. I did miss a year with this last book because I wrote 5 months worth of material that I then had to set aside because it just wasn't going anywhere. But I published 7 books in 7 years, missed a year, and hopefully I'll be back onto that same schedule. And that's honestly talking about sort of the mental and emotional aspects of this. That's to me one of the hardest parts because I wrote for a long time. Again, kind of for me, nobody's expecting this. There's no deadline. There's no timeline. And now suddenly it's my living, and suddenly it's, I'm a cog in this giant publishing machine. And so I think that's part of why it becomes important to sort of understand yourself, to sort of see inside yourself a little bit, and to think about what's really important. Oh yeah, that's super interesting from Jane about growing up in Milwaukee and having those perfectionistic attitudes. Yeah, a strict German family. My family is Swiss German, so super super anal. And I'm very productive, but it's not, I think, in the end, a very helpful thing. Let's see. And then Diana asked, could you elaborate on what it is that visual artists do that you as a writer connected to? That's an interesting question. What I envy about most visual artists is that as a novelist, I have every project basically takes a year. And what I love that visual artists get to do is they can fail faster, right? You can, if you're a watercolor artist, if you're an oil painter, if you're a sculptor, a potter, right? You can make multiple projects, and some are going to work and some are going to maybe not work quite as well. So I'm envious of that. But I don't think I can change that. I don't think I can radically, I don't think I can write a book in 2 months. I know people who do it. That's just not ever going to be me. But the challenges are the same. To make something essentially out of whole cloth that is new. I think there are artists who work in the equivalent way as outliners, right? They come up with an idea and they sketch it out, and then they project it onto a canvas and they paint it in, right? So that's essentially making an outline as a writer. But there are more artists who really are improvisational. They say, okay, I'm gonna make, I have an idea for a sculpture, and now I need to gather the material and I need to think about how to do it. You are creating something out of whole cloth. There's a great book by Twyla Tharp. I don't have the title of it. And she's a choreographer, modern dance. And I'm so not a dancer, but I really am interested in everything. And she writes about how she creates a dance out of nothing. And to me, it's this extraordinary act of creation. And again, I'm a physical person, but no one would ever call me graceful. But this idea that you start with nothing, you start with a series of movements and you see how they tie together. To me, that's absolutely what, as a pantser, what writing a novel is like. And so actually that segues into Brigitte's next question, which is, when you start a novel, do I start with an idea of the subject matter that I want to cover first, or a scene? So I start with a place, because all of these books take place in different locations. The first book's set in Milwaukee. The second book is set on the West Coast. The third book is set in Denver. The fourth book is set in Memphis. The fifth book is set in Iceland. So I need the place, and the place will often suggest some themes or a kind of story. That's the best thing about changing settings, is it suggests story and also provides you a character. But I begin then with sort of with a setup. So my new book, The Price You Pay, begins with I began with the idea that Peter Ash, my hero, who often gets himself into trouble and then has to call his best friend Lewis to come help him out, that I was going to reverse those, that this was going to be a book about Lewis. Readers have been asking me to write this book about Lewis, who's this sort of mysterious, semi-retired career criminal that Peter has become best friends with. And so to turn that around, Lewis is the one who has a problem, and he calls on Peter for help. And it lets me dive into Lewis a little bit more. But that was kind of all I had. And then I thought, okay, well, how do I start this? And it begins with Peter waking up in the middle of the night in his house, because Peter, one of the things these books do is they trace Peter's progress through his post-traumatic stress. So by now, Peter has a love interest and he can live inside. But so he wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning to a sound in his kitchen. He creeps downstairs with a gun, and it's his friend Lewis making a pot of coffee and some peanut butter sandwiches. And Lewis says, "Hey, I got a problem. You want to take a ride with me?" Peter says, "Of course." And Lewis says, "Dress warm, leave your phone, bring the gun." And that was kind of all I had. And then it kind of unspools from there. So it's a weird process to start with a sort of situation like that. But every time I try to start with a big idea, it just gets boring, quite frankly. For me, whenever I try to outline something, I lose interest. The better the outline gets, the less interested I am in actually writing the book. So any other thoughts here? I love these questions, by the way. They're all still muted. Oh, there we go. Oh, what about Mingus? So Mingus is a fan favorite. in the first book, the first book begins with Peter Ash having learned that a friend of his has killed himself. And he travels to Milwaukee to help his friend Jimmy's widow. And all he thinks that he can do is help fix up her house, which needs some love. And she says, yeah, that's great, but there's this big ugly dog under my front porch that won't go out. And by the way, the animal control came out from the city and they took one look and they turned around and they walked the other direction. And so Peter basically decides that that's his first job, is to get this dog out from under the porch. And so that's that first scene in the book. And Mingus becomes a full-blown character. Mingus in that first book is kind of Peter's doppelganger, kind of a wild animal, kind of broken, but with a lot of personality. Mingus is definitely a fan favorite. And he came back in my sixth book, which takes place also in Milwaukee, but in kind of a different version of Milwaukee. And that one's called The Breaker. Excuse me. Oh, and another question about word count. Is my 1,000 words a day basically near the final version of those 1,000 words? I would say probably not. I am a big rewriter as I go. So I begin every day by looking at the previous 2 or 3 days worth of work and honing that prose and finding, dialing up the emotion or fine tuning the conversation, or the relationship that I'm trying to show. One of the reasons why these books, I think, are popular, and I think I have also the reason I have more female readers than male readers, is that I'm really interested in character, right? These are thrillers, these are fast-paced books, but they really begin with character and the character relationships. So I'm always tuning those up. So I go back and I rewrite, and then I move forward. And I try not to be too anal about the day's words. I try to get really focused in on the previous couple of days' words. And it just gets refined and refined and refined. And by the end, I really have 2 weeks to kind of go through and to clean up the last of it and to make some changes that I've kind of left in all caps that I didn't want to sort of lose momentum to go back and insert. So I'll just leave an all caps comment in. But I will probably write, to get 100,000 words, I will probably write 150,000 words, because I'm throwing out scenes, or I'm trying new things, or I'm sketching out scenes that don't happen. So there we go. Any other thoughts here before we're ready to go? I think it's about 2 to noon here on my time.
I think we're good. Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful.
Well, thank you. I'm curious if this is helpful. So if you guys have some thoughts, Janice has got my email, I think.
Yes.
I'm super curious to know which parts of this resonate with you and which parts don't. So I'd love to hear some feedback on this.
Well, you were wonderful, and I think we all got something out of it today. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the interest, and I mean, I love having these conversations with other writers about kind of what, we're sort of all in this together. And I had a conversation with Jeffrey Deaver a couple of weeks ago at a festival, and he's just a very charming guy, but he said, yeah, I've written 50 books and a couple hundred short stories, and every time I start something new, I just think, boy, I wonder if this is the book where they're going to figure out I have no idea what I'm doing and they're not going to let me do it anymore. And like, there's a real universality to that, right? If Jeffrey Deaver, 50 books in, has this thought, then it's okay for me at 8 books in to still have that same thought, that maybe this is just part of this process. Again, it's that acceptance of the self-doubt and uncertainty of the process. So every time I go to a conference, every time I have a phone call with a writer friend, there's always some aspect of this. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, just curious, will you be at BoucherCon?
I will not be at VoucherCon. This is a kind of a strange year for me. I have a whole bunch of other stuff around that time. I've got, I don't know, I think I'm doing like 8 festivals this year, something like that. So it's, I've sort of decided that VoucherCon is something I can do another year. I don't know if I'm going to have another year quite like this.
Yeah.
But I do love VoucherCon, and I love those conversations for sure.
Well, I'm sure you'll be running into some sisters in crime now, wherever you go.
Well,
So-
I hope so. I hope so.
Oh. Well, thank you again so much. And I think this will be a good time to let you go, but we'll be seeing you in your books and other places. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, all of you, and I hope you have a wonderful Saturday.
And you too. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.